Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erica George. I'm the director of the Tanner Humanities Center, and it is my pleasure to introduce Taylor Johnson, who is the first graduate student in our speaker of Works in Progress this spring, 2021. She's had a year like none other, as we've all been moving through the changes and challenges of our pandemic period in time, but she's really been a tremendous contributor to our community. We meet Fridays as fellows, and Taylor is our timekeeper and inspiration in these group writing virtual visits that we have with one another each week. She's really been a tremendous colleague and has some exciting news and a job to go to in the fall. But for those of you who do not know how terrific Taylor is, I'm going to briefly introduce her and then turn the time over to her to present her work that is a portion of her dissertation. But Taylor Johnson is a doctoral student in the Department of Communications at the University of Utah. She received her BA in History from the University of Central Florida and her MA in Environmental Communications from James Madison University. Her research sits at the intersections of Indigenous studies and environmental justice, with a primary focus on the role of settler colonialism in environmental decision-making processes. She has accepted a position as an assistant professor in the Department of Race, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, and we're very excited for her. She will start that this fall. Also, if you want to know more about Taylor, on our website, we've got a Q&A with her offering advice on how to survive a pandemic, what books you should be reading, where you should be eating in Salt Lake. It is my pleasure to celebrate and congratulate Taylor Johnson and to turn the time over to her to speak with you about decolonizing publicity, Indigenous resistance, and public participation in the Bears Ears National Monument controversy. Please join me in welcoming Taylor Johnson.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erica. And thank you all for coming. I want to welcome you and extend my appreciation for taking the time out of your day to come to my presentation. I'm coming to you from my apartment here in Mill Creek, which is on Ute, Eastern Shoshone, Paiute, and Goshute lands. And I want to talk a little bit about who I am and how I came to this research project before I really jump into talking about the dissertation. So I grew up in rural Missouri in the Ozarks on Osage, Kickapoo, and Oceti-Sakowin territory. And I spent a lot of my time growing up running around on public lands in national forests and fishing on lakes and in creeks, and really running around in spaces that were designated for people to be able to use recreationally without a lot of industrial development around, in part because I grew up in a working class family that didn't have a lot of money to do a lot of sort of recreational things. So being able to go out in the woods and just kind of run around or go fishing was a really accessible activity for us. And that was really important to the way that I grew up and the way that I sort of developed my relationship to the place that I lived and the places that I have lived since then. At the same time, in retrospect, as an adult, I look back at those times and I think about, for example, all of the times that I went to national parks and visited visitor centers where the entire story was about white people, about the pioneers who came and discovered these lands and settled them, and where the voices of Indigenous people were really erased. So when I came to Salt Lake City and I started learning about the fight to protect Bears Ears, and I started hearing people talking about how important public lands to them were as non-Indigenous people living in Salt Lake City, but then I also was hearing Indigenous people talk about how important Bears Ears is to them culturally and religiously, I realized that there was sort of a tension in some of the conversations that were happening here. And I really then became driven to ask, who is the public in public lands, and to really think about how public lands designation processes and environmental decision-making structures more broadly really function within the context of settler colonialism. So I wanted to ask questions like, Who is the public and public lands? What does it mean for Indigenous people to have to work through the settler government to protect their territories from extractive industries like uranium mining and oil and gas extraction? And what does it mean that the decision-making authority about these places is still vested in the settler government? And then how can I, as a settler scholar who has the resources of the university behind me, deploy my dissertation project to argue for decision-making processes that aren't rooted in settler colonialism? So those are sort of the questions that really drove me to my project, which is about Bears Ears broadly. I want to give you a little bit of background about Bears Ears and the fight to protect it, and then I'll jump into talking a bit about the chapter that I want to present today. So Bears Ears was established as a national monument by President Obama in 2016, and that came after a proposal for the monument was submitted by an intertribal coalition that was made up of the Navajo Nation, the Hopi tribe, the Ute Indian tribe, the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, and the Zuni tribe. The monument designation was designed to protect the area from a couple of threats. One was the expansion of industrial development, particularly uranium mining and oil and gas extraction. Another threat that was posed to the area was erosion, primarily from recreational activities like ATV use and the use of metal-tipped hiking poles. And a third really major threat to the area was looting and vandalism of historic sites and artifacts to be sold on the black market or for visitors to take home as souvenirs. So the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition got together and proposed that 1.9 million acres in San Juan County needed to be protected, and that the best way to protect this area would be by designating it as a national monument. All of the lands within that 1.9 million acres were already federally owned, and they were already managed by the federal government, but they weren't designated as a national monument, and there was sort of a patchwork of designations in the area. The area, 1.9 million acres, I remind you, had a single federal officer to protect the entire region, and there was no sort of comprehensive designation that would prevent extractive industries, that would really successfully prevent looting or vandalism. And so because of this, the area has faced significant threats. So the proposal called for a national monument to address this problem. And the Obama administration accepted the proposal with some revisions. Rather than 1.9 million acres, the Obama administration proclaimed a 1.35 million acre monument. So most of the area, but not all of it. And those exclusions appear to have been strategic to allow for continued extractive development. And while the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition had proposed a collaborative management plan that would allow all 5 tribes to share decision-making authority with the federal government, the Obama proclamation that established this monument modified that collaborative management plan to assign only advisory capacity to the 5 tribes rather than decision-making authority. All of that changed again in 2017 after Donald Trump was inaugurated, when he gutted the monument. He reduced it by 85% to just over 200,000 acres. He also split the monument into 2 separate units that were on opposite sides of the original monument. And he reduced the commission's role that would have been an advisory council to suggest changes for the monument from both of those units, or from the whole monument, to only being one of those 2 units that he had established. So in all, Donald Trump sort of massively reduced not only the size of the monument, but also the authority of Indigenous people to participate in the management of the monument. So I want to then talk about how those reductions in the monument, as well as in the decision-making authority of Indigenous people in managing the monument, functions to reinforce settler colonialism, and how environmental decision-making processes could better support Indigenous self-determination and governance in colonized territories. My dissertation takes up Bears Ears as a case study to answer this question, and each chapter of my dissertation addresses one sort of analytic within this problem. My first chapter talks about how settler conceptions of land contribute to settler colonial violence. So how are the ways that we as settler recreationalists or environmentalists, who might see Bears Ears as a positive thing, still reproducing settler colonialism in the way that we talk about Bears Ears. My second chapter asks about the notion of publicity. When we say that lands are public, what does that mean? Who is the public in public lands or public good or public participation? And then the final chapter asks how models for consultation and collaboration between the federal government and Native nations contribute to settler colonialism, and how those models could be changed to undermine settler colonialism instead. It's this third chapter that I primarily want to talk about today, the ways that the United States federal government talks about collaboration or consultation, and how that rhetoric doesn't necessarily match up with the goals of Indigenous self-determination or sovereignty. So given that, I want to talk a little bit about the ways that we think about sovereignty and consultation and collaboration in current federal models. Western international relations theory tends to think about sovereignty in pretty singular terms. So we think of there being a defined territory that has borders and a single nation has complete jurisdiction over that area, right? So if you're in the United States, you are under US jurisdiction and you have to follow US law. And if you are a resident or a citizen, you pay taxes to the US government, right? That gets more complicated where the relationship between Native nations and the US is involved, because the US has dispossessed Native people of their land for centuries. The vast majority of Indigenous territories have been stolen to support US sovereignty, and the assertion of US sovereignty has been a direct violation of Indigenous sovereignty since the inception of the United States. The US still recognizes the sovereignty of some Native nations, of federally recognized tribes, but it does so in a way that still sort of legitimizes US sovereignty and control as well. For example, by assigning US citizenship to all tribal members. The US also, as a result of this colonial relationship, has what's called a trust relationship with federally recognized tribes. And that trust relationship involves three responsibilities that are codified in US law that the US government has to meet as part of its relationship with Native nations. Those three responsibilities are: one, they have to provide federal services, so things like healthcare and education, to tribal members. Second, the US government has to protect tribal sovereignty from violation either by US citizens or by individual states. And then third, the US government has to protect tribal resources from destruction as a result of federal action. And this third responsibility in the trust relationship, the responsibility to protect tribal resources, is really important when we think about environmental decision making, because when the federal government is thinking about taking an action, whether that be establishing a policy or issuing permits for a project, the federal government then has a responsibility as part of the scoping process for that decision to ask whether that project is likely to harm tribal resources, for example, by damaging an ecosystem or being built through a sacred site. And so in order to meet this responsibility, the United States has an obligation to engage in what is called meaningful consultation and collaboration with tribal officials in their decision-making process. This standard was established in 2000 when Bill Clinton signed Executive Order 13175. Prior to that executive order, there were some requirements for consultation with tribal governments, but they were sort of a patchwork, and there wasn't a single blanket requirement that all federal agencies making any decision that might affect tribes had to interact with tribal governments. And so this executive order created a framework through which federal agencies could be required to work with Native nations whenever they were making decisions that might affect those nations. The problem with this executive order, though, is that it doesn't define what counts as meaningful consultation and collaboration. And it still, at the end of the day, puts all of the final decision-making authority for whatever project is being considered or whatever policy is being considered entirely in the hands of federal agencies, not in the hands of the Native nations who are likely to be affected by those decisions. So what that means is that sometimes federal agencies just kind of treat consultation as a piece of red tape that they have to get through before they can announce and implement a plan that they've already determined they want to make. So for example, when the Dakota Access Pipeline was being planned, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe submitted dozens of comments arguing that the location of the pipeline under the Missouri River would disturb sacred sites and would endanger the community by putting their only source of drinking water in danger. And those comments were largely just brushed off by the US Army Corps of Engineers as irrelevant or unimportant. And as long as the agency is honest about what comments they changed their plan for and what comments they did not change their plan for, that meets the requirement for consultation and collaboration. That gets even more complicated when you think about how the scoping process might not account for community knowledge. So again, if we look at the Dakota Access Pipeline, there was an archaeologist hired to survey the proposed construction site who was supposed to decide whether or not any important sites would be disturbed by the construction project. That archaeologist did not have any ties to the Standing Rock community, nor did he have the institutional knowledge to be able to identify sacred sites beyond being able to identify archaeological evidence like the remains of buildings or the remains of humans. And so that becomes a huge problem when we're thinking about what it means to consult or collaborate with tribal governments. Because if the consultation process is really just, we're going to ask you if you're okay with this, and then we're going to do what we want anyway, that just reproduces settler colonialism. It reproduces a system in which settler needs are prioritized over those of Indigenous people, and a system in which Indigenous people really don't get to participate in the process of making the decision. They get consulted and then ignored. On top of that, federal agencies often approach consultation processes as a bilateral effort between the United States federal government and a single tribal government. And that's fine in some instances. There are some instances where only one tribal government is likely to be affected, and therefore that's the only government that needs to be consulted. But in places like Bears Ears, that's not the case. The reason that the Intertribal Coalition was made up of 5 tribes is because there are numerous Native communities who all have their own histories and traditions, who all have ties to Bears Ears, and who all care enough to want to make sure that it is protected. And so when we assume that a bilateral relationship will be sufficient for a consultation process, one of 2 things typically happens. Either only one tribal government gets consulted, and then that tribal government has to stand in for all of the other nations who, again, have their own histories and traditions that are not necessarily the same as the one government that's being consulted. Or it creates this sort of extended game of telephone where each tribal government has the ability to talk to the US federal government, but there isn't sort of a framework in place for those governments to cooperate with one another. And so there's sort of a lack of collaboration between tribal governments that can result in information being left out or one group being prioritized over another. And so the chapter that I want to talk about today really centers on this problem of consultation and collaboration, and asks, how could we move away from this sort of ineffective consultation model to think about decision-making as an ongoing relationship or partnership between Native nations and the federal government? So I think that for this model to work, a couple of things would need to change. First off, the federal government needs to share decision-making authority with Indigenous nations. Native people need to be partners at every step of the process, not just at one moment of consultation, but from the beginning of when the project is conceived and the decision-making process is being designed to the moment when the criteria for how the decision will be made are being decided upon, to the actual management of a project on the day-to-day basis. And this is sort of what the Bears Ears and our tribal coalition argues for in the context of managing Bears Ears. They argue for a management commission made up of tribal representatives as well as federal representatives that shares decision-making authority. This model sort of rejects the singular notion of sovereignty that Western IR theory provides us with, and instead it adopts what I call a model of relational sovereignty. I draw this understanding of sovereignty from the work of Leanne Simpson, who is a Anishinaabe scholar, and in a chapter on sovereignty for Native keywords, Simpson tells a story about a time that she asked an elder from her community for a word for nation or sovereignty or self-determination. She says that he thought about it for a long time, and then he told her that he remembered his old people saying that you could use the phrase, the place where we all live and work together. So when I think about sovereignty, I think that Bears Ears becomes a site where multiple nations live and work together in partnership to care for a place that all 5 tribes have commitments to. So this doesn't require that any singular tribe give up their individual sovereignty or defer to another tribe or to the federal government. Instead, it necessitates that there's a commitment to deliberation between the 5 tribal governments and the federal government, where all members are partners in shared decision-making authority. So I want to turn to some quotes from the Intertribal Coalition that I think sort of illustrate how they frame this management plan's potential for supporting Native sovereignty. The first thing that I want to talk about is this sort of new collaborative model and how partnership is framed. So over and over and over in the documents that are published on their website, the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition refers to this management plan as a partnership, as being equal. And that highlights that this management plan is sort of a radical step away from models that have undermined Native communities in favor of US authority. And instead, this model honors the sovereignty of Native nations in a way that we really haven't seen in a lot of decision-making processes in the United States. So one example of where they make this argument is in their proposal, where they're talking about how they came to this management plan. And they say, in a long, focused, and well-attended deliberation over this proposal, we have concluded that this new monument must be managed under a sensible, entirely workable regime of true federal tribal collaborative management. We know that this has never been done before, but the most great breakthroughs in public policy have no direct precedent. We want to work with you on this. We have reflected long and hard to come up with the right words to install collaborative management in this particular place and circumstance, and believe in our suggested approach, but we welcome your thoughts on how to improve our formulation. Like you, we want to make the Bears Ears National Monument the shining example of the trust, the government-to-government relationship, and innovative cutting-edge land management. But whatever the specific words might be for the Bears Ears National Monument to be all it can be, the tribes must be full partners with the United States in charting the vision for the monument and implementing that vision. So the Intertribal Coalition here is offering a model for working together that really calls out the federal government for its failure to respect Indigenous sovereignty in the past, and really says, if this monument is to sort of fulfill the goals that it was established for, it must involve cooperation with the tribes, not just at the level of, oh, well, we'll ask you before we make a decision, but at every step of the process. They also talk about the ways that this model can be useful for healing relationships. And the Intertribal Coalition talks about several different kinds of relationships that might be healed through a collaborative management plan. First, they highlight how protecting Bears Ears might be an opportunity for settlers to begin atoning for the colonial violence that we have caused, and to join with Native people in moving toward more desirable futures. So by sharing decision-making authority, we can begin to disrupt the settler colonial system that structures current decision-making models. Second, they talk about the ways that relationships between the 5 tribes have already been strengthened by collaboration. So historically, there have been territorial disputes and other disagreements between members of the Intertribal Coalition. So for example, the Diné people, the Navajo Nation, has had territorial disputes with the Hopi tribe going back almost 100 years. And those territorial disputes have caused, in some cases, really bitter adversarial relationships between members of those two nations. But in working together to attempt to protect Bears Ears, the Intertribal Coalition talks in several places on their website about how those relationships between those nations are beginning to be healed and improved. The third sort of relationship that this collaborative model sort of contributes to healing is the relationship between Native people and settlers and the land. So they talk about this as an opportunity for both Native people and settlers to heal and be healed by the land in the effort of protecting Bears Ears. So, for example, at one on an opinion piece that was published on their website, Robin Wall Kimmerer writes that designating Bears Ears National Monument could aid in healing the land and healing relationships among people by restoring rights of Native peoples to jointly care for their homelands. Protecting this cultural landscape also invites settler society, today's citizens of the United States, to recognize that one day they will be named among the ancestors of these lands. They have a choice as to what kind of ancestors they wish to be. May we humans live in such a way that the land for whom we are grateful will be grateful for our presence in return. And so they really argue here for protecting Bears Ears as a necessary step forward if we are to achieve desirable futures together. And if settler people wish to begin atoning for the violence and our complicity in settler colonial structures. The third thing that I sort of want to talk about is the way that the Intertribal Coalition emphasizes the use of traditional ecological knowledge in the collaborative management plan. They talk about the importance of working in partnership, not just because it can heal relationships, but also because Western knowledge hierarchies devalue Indigenous knowledges and thus are ill-equipped to care for Bears Ears. The 5 tribes have had relationships with Bears Ears dating back tens of thousands of years. In fact, the Navajo Nation has been at Bears Ears since time immemorial. And so to devalue the knowledge that has come from that experience, from the tens of thousands of years of observation and living in and with this ecosystem, is really a problem, not just rhetorically, right? Not just because it devalues Indigenous people, although certainly that is a part of the problem, a huge part of the problem, but also because it means that Western science is not appropriately equipped to care for Bears Ears without also incorporating Indigenous knowledges. And so the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition writes that traditional knowledge and science need to be included in land management, planning, and tribes need to be involved in decision-making processes related to cultural landscapes, from identification and description of the cultural values to the nomination, implementation, and integrative approach to stewardship, by maintaining stable and regenerative relationships with the natural world. It is important to recognize how results differ between consultation and involvement with Indigenous peoples. When we listen to the concerns, values, needs, priorities, and ambitions of Indigenous communities, there is ample potential to bridge and shape robust working partnerships that are authentic, equitable, and inclusive. So the Intertribal Coalition really describes Indigenous knowledge as an essential part of caring for the Bears Ears land, for the Bears Ears region. And so any kind of management plan that does not involve active and ongoing collaboration and sharing decision-making authority with tribal governments will inevitably fall short. Traditional ecological knowledge sort of functions as a way of making decisions that is attuned to the land, and that in some places on the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition website, they describe as understanding the land itself as a partner in that knowledge production process. And so in being attuned to the land in that way, we can reject the sort of settler decision-making processes that often focus primarily on either sustainability, which typically is geared toward trying to balance economic growth with environmental concerns, or that's more concerned with profits that come from extractive industries. We can disrupt those sort of ways of thinking about decisions in favor of decisions that are rooted in the knowledges of the people who have been in this place long, long before settlers appeared. So given this, I think that there are a few takeaways that environmental decision-making scholars and practitioners can sort of get from the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition's proposal for a collaborative management plan. The first is that I think that the consultation and collaboration approach needs to be replaced with true and long-lasting partnerships that include Indigenous people at every step of the process. This requires that regulatory frameworks be treated not just as red tape or as a bureaucratic requirement for a decision, but instead that they be treated as sort of a floor that is designed to call toward an impetus for collaboration, right? So rather than thinking of consultation or collaboration as just a requirement, agencies really need to think of consultation and collaboration as a starting point to say, okay, how can we develop meaningful ongoing partnerships and share our decision-making authority? Which brings me to the second takeaway, which is that decision-making authority cannot be placed solely in the hands of federal agencies. It has to be shared with Native nations. That means not treating Native governments as advisors for decisions, but rather as equal stakeholders and equal power holders in the decision-making process. Third, I think that we need a process that accounts for the multitude of Indigenous people that might share commitments to a particular place. And therefore, we need processes that are not by default bilateral. Instead, we need processes that are multilateral and that create space for there to be active collaboration between multiple nations. Finally, I think that we can't have just a one-size-fits-all process. So what I mean by this is that those regulatory frameworks cannot be assumed to be the entirety of what a process will look like in any given moment. Instead, we need to design processes in situ, in partnership with the Native communities and governments who are likely to be affected. So rather than having a federal agency that says, okay, we are going to have a public comment period, and then we're going to engage in 4 meetings with this tribal government, and then we're going to, talk to the company in this way, and then we're going to make a decision. Federal agencies need to come into a project asking Native governments, what should this process look like? How should we make this decision? What should the criteria be for making this decision? What kinds of input do we need? Where do we need to hold the meetings to make sure that the members of your community are able to participate? When can we hold them that will be most accessible? And all of those things have to happen on a case-by-case basis. They can't sort of be decided as a one-size-fits-all regulation. So those are the 4 sort of primary things I see needing to change in order to move toward a model that better resembles what the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition is calling for. With all of that said, I think that this is just a starting place and just sort of a step in the right direction rather than an ending point or the end-all be-all of what could make environmental decision-making more supportive of Indigenous sovereignty. So I think that there needs to be a lot more work done on this topic, and that both scholars and practitioners need to reflect really intensely about how environmental decision-making processes can be better and more directed toward the futures that we actually want to achieve. So with all of that said, I am excited to hear your thoughts and to answer your questions.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. So that was extraordinary. I will be taking a queue of questions for Taylor. Also, we can monitor the chat, though I'd invite you to use your little blue hand next to your participant name and let us know if you have questions. So, scrolling and seeing no little blue hands as yet. Oh wait, there's a hand, but I can't tell whose it is. Oh, okay. So Ms. Olanya, please just feel free to ask the question and unmute yourself. Okay, or I will just share. This question says, Taylor, I'm curious as to the ways that you model critical reflexivity in your dissertation and specifically this chapter. So Taylor, I see this as an invitation to comment further on how you're modeling.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Lulu, for that question. One of the things in the dissertation broadly that I did, and that I think is really valuable as a settler scholar doing textual analysis, is that I asked for permission before I analyzed any of the documents that are in the dissertation. And that actually ended up affecting what the dissertation looked like, because I wasn't able to get in contact with some of the authors of some of the texts that I had originally hoped to analyze. And so those texts ended up not being a part of the analysis because I didn't want to be irresponsible in my analysis by not asking for consent before I analyzed them. That's not something that is necessarily expected of people doing textual criticism, right? That's not an IRB requirement. That's not something that is always talked about in methods courses about textual analysis, but it was something that was important both to me and my committee. That also allowed me to have some conversations with Jacqueline Keeler, who is the editor of a book about Bears Ears and is a member of the Diné community, that were really helpful for both thinking about my role as a researcher and learning more about the context of the situation and being directed toward contextual elements that I don't think that I would have really recognized ahead of time. So those are a couple of the ways that I've tried to be reflexive and be responsible in my research practices in this dissertation.
Okay, wonderful. And now I can see the hand that is attached to the question. Professor Andres, Danielle Andres.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Taylor. This was great. Of course, I know a lot about the project anyway. So I do want to ask you a question because I just know from knowing you that you're really interested in ways that your research can affect ongoing controversies, can be brought to bear practically. And so we know that the Biden administration is now reconsidering what to do with Bears Ears. So let's say you got a phone call from Biden. He does like to make phone calls, or maybe someone from his team. What would be that sort of top 3 recommendations that you would give to the team that's investigating this right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Danielle. I think that the first recommendation I would give would be make the monument the size that the Intertribal Coalition asked for it to be and follow the borders that they asked for it to be, because they are the ones who have taken the time to do cultural surveys, to do geologic surveys, and to really evaluate where the borders of the monument need to be. Similarly, the second suggestion I would give would be give decision-making authority to the Bears Ears, to the Bears Ears Planning Commission, which is the name of the commission that was proposed in the proposal, right? So give decision-making authority to them. Don't make them just advisors. Let them make the decisions. And then the third, and this may be, my guess is probably something the Biden administration will do, is I didn't mention this in my talk, but when Donald Trump shrunk the monument and changed the structure of the commission, he also added a 9th member to that commission who would represent the San Juan County Commission, which has historically been pretty antagonistic to Native people, particularly to the Navajo Nation. So I think that my third suggestion would probably be remove that person from the commission and allow the commission to just be the 5 tribal representatives and the 3 federal representatives who were originally proposed by the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. So I guess all 3 of those sort of boil down to just like do the things that the Intertribal Coalition asked for. But I mean, I really think that's the answer. Like, they're the ones who know what needs to happen. They're the ones who have been fighting for Bears Ears for decades. And so the people who are at the forefront of that fight are the ones who should be making recommendations that we're listening to.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. The next question is in the chat, and this comes from Kenzie. Can you speak more about how the way people here in Salt Lake City view the Bears Ears situation differently than the coalition of tribes? As someone newish to the area, I'm really unfamiliar with these differences. That could be quite loaded, right? Because even if you were closer to the monument, there's lots of different views.
Oh, yeah.
So could you help us navigate that for those who may not be as steeped in this controversy?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Kenzie. That's a question that I think I've been thinking a lot more about sort of more recently in my writing. So I'm really glad to get to sort of keep thinking through it here. I have noticed when I've had conversations about Bears Ears with people who are not either themselves Indigenous or sort of engaged with Indigenous struggle in some way, whether that be because of their activism or their scholarship or both or whatever. When I've talked to people who are not engaged with Indigenous struggle, but who care about Bears Ears, a lot of times they're talking about it in terms of two things. Either they'll say things like, well, public lands are our lands. They belong to all of us. They are things that we need to protect for our children or for future generations, or just because they're ours, which I think really re-legitimates those settler colonial understandings of land that assume that non-Indigenous people have ownership over or belonging in colonized territories, which we don't. We are here as uninvited guests who, and that's a term that Hokulani Aikau in the Gender Studies Department uses a lot. We're here as uninvited guests and we don't have ownership over that place, and we shouldn't claim to have ownership over it. That was really present in last semester. Patagonia published a documentary about public lands that dealt with Bears Ears as well as the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the border waters in the Midwest, and the boundary waters, and that rhetoric, I think, can be really harmful. The second difference that I've really noticed between the way that settlers seem to talk about, settlers who are in support of Bears Ears in particular, right? The second difference that I've noticed between the way that settlers who are in support of Bears Ears talk about it versus the way that Indigenous people fighting for Bears Ears talk about it is that settlers often just talk about it as like this beautiful natural vista or this like place that we can go and recreate and be with nature. And while those things are also in the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition's proposal and in their rhetoric, what's missing is an analysis of the history and the relationship that Indigenous people have to Bears Ears. So when I hear settlers talking about Bears Ears, often it stops at, well, it's beautiful and a great place to hike. Whereas when Indigenous people are talking about it, they say, yes, it's beautiful and it's a great place to hike, but also our ancestors are buried here. Our ancestors have lived here for tens of thousands of years, and their sites are being disturbed and vandalized and looted by settlers, and that has to stop. And so those are sort of, I think, problems that are often just missing from a settler discussion of Bears Ears.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to turn next to Kevin Coe, who has his hand raised. We'll be asking the question verbally, and then I'll turn back to the next chat question. Kevin.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Taylor, for this talk. This was really interesting and important work that you're doing. I have a question about methods. One of the things that fascinates me about communication scholarship is that most of us engage text in some way, but we do it in lots of different ways, right? And we ground it in different traditions and talk about it in different terms. And so I'm just curious, when you approach these texts to do your analysis, how do you characterize it? So I heard you say textual analysis. Is that how you primarily characterize it? And then if you could just talk about your process, what do you actually do when you get into these documents?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kevin. So I actually, in the dissertation, I characterize what I do as rhetorical analysis. And I think I characterize it as critical rhetorical analysis. So for me, what that means on sort of a theoretical scale is that I'm working with the text to understand how power is sort of dispersed through discourse. And in process, for me, what that typically looks like, or what that looks like for this project anyway, is I started by just collecting all of the texts that I wanted to look at, right? So that included the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition's proposal, the presidential proclamations, a couple of other federal regulations, like the National Environmental Policy Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, the Antiquities Act, and a ton of documents that were published on the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition's website. And I start by really just trying to spend time with those documents, thinking what's happening here, right? So I read through all of them pretty thoroughly. I used NVivo actually to code them this time around, which is the first time that I've used NVivo on a project. So that was interesting and fun. And once I had sort of an idea of what seemed to be the big themes that I'm noticing in these texts, then I sort of go back to Indigenous studies theory, which obviously is always playing in my mind because that's the sort of theoretical grounding that I have coming into the project. But I start then really consulting Indigenous studies theory more closely to see if there are places where those themes that I'm noticing seem to fit within that conversation and can contribute. And then I kind of go through a process of going back and forth between the theories and the texts and trying to figure out exactly what is the argument that I want to make and how do I want to make that argument using the text that I have in front of me.
Sorry, I was on mute. So I see Hannah's hand, but I'm going to go back to the chat first because there's a question from Robin Jensen. Can you tell us a bit about the next steps in this project? What are the next steps in this project? So this would be a wonderful book. I wholeheartedly agree. And Robin would love to hear about how you're thinking about this work as it continues to develop. This certainly doesn't seem like a one and done project. So what's next for you? What's next for this project? How does this grow?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Robin, for that question. I do have one chapter from the dissertation has been submitted as an article at Frontiers in Communication. I just submitted it, so it's pretty early in the review process, but it's been submitted for a special issue on race, colonialism, and the outdoors. And so I'm excited to see where that goes. But as a whole, I think that I do want to pursue a book for this project. One thing that I think that I would like to do for the book, and that I think I'm hopefully going to have the support to do at La Crosse because I am going to have a research fund for my first 2 years, is pursue interviews with members of the Intertribal Coalition or other members of the 5 tribes. Robin, you know from my prospectus meeting that was something that we had talked about early on with this project, and then the combination of the time limits of writing a dissertation as well as the realities of writing a dissertation in the middle of a global pandemic kind of got in the way of being able to do that. And I'm really happy with the textual analysis that I've produced, but I do think that having sort of one-on-one conversations with people who have been involved in this fight would really enrich this project more. So that's something that I'm hoping I can do as a faculty member.
Okay, fantastic. Hannah.
Hi, Taylor. Thank you so much for your talk. It was great. Oops, sorry. I'm meant to move my hand, but now I'm just clapping. So I am thrilled, as everyone here is, I'm sure, to know that you're a success story. You got a job, a tenure track job. It's wonderful, and I'm curious as I'm listening to you talk, particularly as I listen to the question about, say President Biden called you, about like how you see your scholarship and like, do you see yourself? I mean, obviously, in the future you're going to be kind of working within the academy. But do you also see your scholarship as like having a role in activism? Like, are you hoping that people are going to be picking up your dissertation and using it as like, using it in activism? Are you hoping that it has a policy like implications in your dissertation? So I'm just curious, like, often, we think about the academy as being separate, depending on your discipline, or just like a place for, bouncing around ideas, and maybe in your case, just, thinking about settler colonialism. And I'm curious, like, how you see, if at all, your dissertation and your research really like making an impact on the communities that you're studying.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So there are, I think, two things for me that I see my scholarship is hopefully doing. One is being an amplifier, right? So the way that the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition is talking about land and publicity and collaboration, those are things that I think as a scholar, I have the resources to amplify their voices and say, this is what they're saying about what needs to happen. So why aren't we doing it? And the second, which I guess is related to that, is that I do hope that I can use this research to work with either people who facilitate environmental decision-making processes or with the policymakers who design the processes to fight for the processes themselves to be more attuned to Indigenous goals. So that might potentially look like writing a white paper that comes out of this research and sharing it with folks who have the power to change how these decision-making processes get made. That might look like, just talking one-on-one. It might look like participating in city councils or other sort of local government, right? Those kind of decisions, I think I have to wait until I get to my new home and find out how everything there works politically. But yeah, I think that I absolutely see there being policy implications of this dissertation that come out of attempting to amplify the arguments that the Intertribal Coalition is already making.
Wonderful. I want to echo that. And I also should add, Hannah Jung is our other graduate student fellow who will have a work in progress presentation in April. So stay tuned and return to learn about her work as well. Transitioning back to the chat question, we now have a question from Madison Crawl. Thank you for your wonderful talk, Taylor. I appreciate your response to Danielle's question about the Biden administration reaching out to you with your suggestions. What recommendations do you have for members of the public visiting Bears Ears and other dispossessed lands as uninvited guests to respect the space and to bring awareness to Indigenous concerns concerning that location, for example?
Yeah, thank you so much, Madison. That question is, I think, complicated because I think that the answer is always going to be contextual and dependent on the needs of the nation whose lands you're visiting. In the context of Bears Ears, right now in March of 2021, my advice is don't visit because the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition has asked people not to visit during the COVID crisis. Oh. And so my first answer is, look, if there are Indigenous groups that are organizing around a place, look at their websites, sign up for their newsletters, and if they ask you to do something, do it. This is actually one of the reasons that I haven't been able to visit Bears Ears while I've been writing, because the pandemic started and the Intertribal Coalition said, please don't come. And so right now at this moment, my answer for Bears Ears is don't go until it is safe for you to go, because the Native communities who have been fighting for Bears Ears are also suffering some of the highest rates of COVID in the nation, are struggling to get the resources and the infrastructure that they need to recover from COVID. And so putting those communities more at risk, I think, is an inherently unethical thing to do. But if we were not in a crisis, right? If we were not in the middle of a global pandemic, I think that my answer would be begin by trying to learn about the nations whose lands you're visiting, see what their expectations are for when you visit. In the context of Bears Ears, the Intertribal Coalition runs a visitor center that you can visit to learn about Bears Ears from an Indigenous perspective. That's true in some other places as well. So find out if there's a visitor center, and if there is a visitor center, find out what kind of agency or organization runs it. Is it, right, if you're going to a national park, most of the time it's going to be run by the Park Service, and it's probably going to be run by settlers and have a settler narrative. But if there's a visitor center that actively promotes Indigenous perspectives, go to it and learn. I guess that really kind of sums up all of the advice, is try to learn from the people whose lands you are visiting. About what their expectations are and about the history of the place and about how you can respectfully engage in that place.
Okay, wonderful. Taylor, actually, I am going to ask you a question and invite you later to perhaps share resources. I wasn't aware that the Intertribal Coalition had their own visitor center information, and that's something that we'd be happy to distribute on the Tanner Humanities website in connection with the video of your talk and the page that we have for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for reminding us to remain cognizant, particularly as I think there's a lot of energy around Bears Ears protection. You've talked about how the narratives around it differ. Really important for us to listen, and thank you for amplifying. I don't see another hand raised, so I'm going to turn back to the chat or ask another chat question. And I also want to be respectful of everyone's time. So this is probably the last question during our formal time. You're of course welcome to stay and continue to engage with Taylor while we have her with us. This is from Allison Nicole Bomling. Thank you so much for this awesome talk, Taylor. I've enjoyed learning about your work. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about other facets and arguments of your dissertation work, since I know this chapter is just one part of it. So Taylor, I read that as an invitation for you to comment more broadly about how this fits into the larger project.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Allison. So this is, like I said, the third chapter of the dissertation. The other two take up, each chapter is about Bears Ears, but it takes up a different analytic for understanding how settler colonialism and environmental participation play out in the context of Bears Ears. So the first chapter asks about conceptions of land. So ultimately, the sort of like most boiled down version of the argument in the first chapter is that settler conceptions of land posit land as dead and as resource, and in doing so, justify violence against Indigenous communities and against Indigenous territories. And that the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition offers a perspective on land as partner in decision making, as alive, as animate, and that in doing so, they are oriented toward caring for the land in a way that is based on mutual respect and reciprocal care, rather than on the sort of profit motives or self-driven motives that settlers often use. The second chapter asks the question of who is the public in public lands. And ultimately, I sort of say, in environmental decision making, one of the requirements is public participation. You have to collect input from the public. But that conception of the public assumes that Indigenous people want to be part of the American public. And if the goal is decolonization, if the goal is, as Tuck and Yang define decolonization as native futures without a settler state, if that's the goal that we want to work toward, and I think that it is, then our solution to asking affected communities about how we should make decisions can't just be to enfold Indigenous people into the American public, because it kind of re-legitimizes the settler state and re-legitimizes settler society and says, well, Native Americans are just a subset of Americans. And in a way that is quite untrue, right? Because Americans exist because of settler colonialism. An understanding of the United States cannot be separated from a history of settler colonialism. And so I sort of take up that question of publicity and ask sort of how, particularly within the field of rhetoric, right, where we are especially concerned with public deliberation and public discourse, how can we maybe change the way that we're thinking about discourse and deliberation to move away from this conception of publicity that I think sort of re-legitimates settler colonialism?
Wow, extraordinary. Well, that is the time that we have for today for this conversation. Taylor, thank you very much. Those of you who have joined us, thank you very much. We welcome you to come to the upcoming works in progress that we have. Next, we'll have Professor Franta, who is next Thursday, and then we'll have Hannah next month. So please do watch our website. We appreciate your feedback, so be in touch. And please join me in thanking and congratulating Taylor Johnson. Wonderful.